Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Leadership Launchpad's Pick and Mix podcast, and we are joined by the great Mary Myatt, and we'll get her to introduce herself in a moment. So let me just share the screen as we normally do, and we can get cracking. So I think here we go. So yeah, I mean, if you don't know who Mary is, where have you been in education? Um, I think we could probably do, I don't know, a day's worth of recording to talk about all the things she's done. And we'll only be able to get a little snippet of it here. But yeah, let's get straight into kind of, I guess, the title. I mean, the things you do. Let's tell me a bit about what your role is at the moment.
Oh, Chris, it's great to have the chance to chat with you. I think this is a brilliant model for a podcast, and so all credit to you and really deepening the learning from the great themes that you've identified in the Leadership Launchpads book. What my background very quickly is secondary religious education.
Right.
Taught in London and Cambridge most part of my career, just outside Ipswich in Suffolk, in the local authority in Suffolk. And then since 2011, I have been working in schools, talking to pupils, teachers, and leaders about learning leadership and the curriculum.
Hmm.
And then, in order to clarify my own thinking, I've written about it in blogs and books, and one or two people have found them helpful. And so I have a number of online platforms. The main one is Myatt and Co, where we have over 500 recordings and webinars to support ongoing professional development. I'm doing a big piece of work, and I'm launching it this afternoon,
Oh,
on Key Stage 3, reframing it as the intellectual powerhouse of the secondary school.
oh, exciting.
And it's reframing really the Ofsted report of nearly 10 years or so ago. Now, Key Stage 3, the wasted years was the question
Right.
mark. And while there was some good practice going on, for the most part, it was slightly tired at Key Stage 3. To be fair, since then, there have been some improvements in history and geography in particular, but overall, it hasn't really shifted enough. So, always important to say there's really great practice going on,
Sure.
but there's more that can be done. And my view is it's possible to do that just through a different lens,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily more work. So that's the big piece of work I'm currently
Great.
engaged on. And then for primary, we have the Teachers Collection underpinned by the research from the University of Sussex with gorgeous text suggestions
Yeah.
linked to the programs of study in the national curriculum, and then planning units and vocab lists and a ton of other resources. So all really based around curriculum inclusion and pedagogy at the heart of it.
Oh, I love that. And something you said earlier, which I think would be helpful for the listeners, is this idea that a lot of your writing has been so that you can clarify your thinking. And I think for me, that was where I started kind of blogging and where I think some people resist that writing process because they feel that maybe they're doing it initially for an external audience. Was your first thoughts more of a private victory than public when you started to write?
I really just wanted to share what I noticed was going
Yeah.
on in different settings, particularly sharing what I saw as strong practice underpinned by principles of equity and inclusion, and what that looked like with leaders and the curriculum, and always looking out for the children who might have lower starting points. And this.
Sure.
So it was really to keep a record initially of what I was seeing. But
Yeah.
then when it went further and bigger pieces of work with the books, what I found was as I wrote, new insights came to me
Yeah.
that I don't believe they would have done if I hadn't been writing. And that's quite well documented elsewhere.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, that was my experience.
And again, that resonates massively with me. And so we've probably spoken a little bit about why, but I guess your role and your work is quite varied. How does a typical week look if there is one?
It does vary.
Yeah, I
It
can
does
imagine.
vary. And so, if I just say the last couple of weeks, so I was recording materials for the Myatt and Co platform. I was also talking with trust leaders about our work, where
Okay.
they're interested in being involved. Did a face-to-face conference with about 100 primary head teachers
Wow.
from the south, and then went from there to Sheffield to support a school that needs some additional support. And then so far this week, I've spent 2 days in London at the Institute of Directors, working with 30 aspiring CEOs and some
Okay.
existing CEOs new to role, uh, sharing with them ideas about the curriculum. So
Yeah.
it's very, very varied. And one
Wow.
of the things I'll be doing this week is scheduling some visits um, to schools, really for my own research and
Yeah.
interest. So yeah,
That's
very
such a
varied.
great, that feels like such a great balance of grassroots impact and then really quite high, if you're working with CEOs, that's about as high as the impact sort of level gets, isn't it? But you enjoy those, having a balance of those two sort of things.
Yes, I don't think I could have um, any credibility at all if I weren't also talking directly to teachers,
Yeah.
either in schools or online, and then when I'm in school talking to pupils. It has to inform everything we do, I believe.
Yeah.
And so it can't just be the theoretical stuff, interesting as that is. It's always got to be grounded by the children in front
Yeah.
of us. Mm.
I mean, this isn't a particularly eloquent phrase, it only just came to me, but something about being on the ground as well as up in the clouds.
Mm.
You can't be
Mm.
either of the two, can you? Which is fascinating.
Mm.
All right. Well, as per normal, if you're new to the podcast, we've got a kind of structure that we use to go through it, and Mary's selected some things ahead of time that we'll use as sort of stimuli. The first thing that she's selected is what we call a fast friends question, which is a question that helps create connection between people. And Mary had a selection to choose from, and her first question was this one: for what in your life do you feel most grateful? What was your thinking around that, Mary?
Well, I think that gratitude is one of the greatest gifts and dispositions that we can develop
Mm.
in ourselves, and support others to do the same as well. And one of the reasons I think it's important to actually talk about it when it's appropriate is that, um, for one thing, it's an absolute miracle that there's any life at all of any form.
Yeah,
The let alone us as human beings,
sure.
now, at this moment, at this time, the congruence of so many elements of the natural world coming together to create these conditions is
Yeah,
just remarkable. And so I think that quality of um, yeah, wonder and just amazing to remind ourselves of that, and then linked to that is to be grateful, even even when times are tough.
yeah,
And then secondly, there's a great deal of research that it's not the primary reason for doing it, but it so happens there's a lot of research that says it's very good psychologically.
mm,
It's also sitting there very much in spiritual traditions,
yeah,
including meditative practice. So for all those reasons, I thought that gratitude was important.
yeah. And have you got something that comes to mind when you think? I guess it changes minute by minute, hour by hour. But
Mm.
I guess what have you been grateful about this week so far?
I'll have to say, when I come back, it's slightly at a tangent from any long journeys, and often they are, and quite late. Um, I always say thank you to whoever's um, whatever force has allowed me to arrive safely. And so
Sure.
I'm always really, really grateful to be back at base.
Yeah.
Um, and so for this week, it has been in particular my lovely daughter-in-law. I'm particularly grateful to her because she has very kindly booked my ticket to go on the ferry to the Isle of Wight, where I'll get a chance to catch up with mini Myatts, the grandchildren.
Oh,
So
I
that's
love
a
it.
very specific one.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting link because we've started only in the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks. We always have a kind of Sunday roast on a Sunday, and we started integrating into that a kind of round the table, what are you grateful for conversation. And again, I think I spoke to, well, for the listeners, me and Mary were speaking offline before we came on about how that wouldn't be a natural thing for me to have done in 10, 15, hour a year ago maybe. But I've been completely taken by it, that my young children, they're 14 and 11, you know, are being required to think about, and be reminded of all the things that they're grateful for. And so yeah, interesting. So the next thing we're going to talk about, which is another element of our podcasts and slightly different to maybe traditional podcast formats, is this idea of an ignition point or an event in someone's life that creates a transformation. And again, Mary's been going to select kind of two of these today, and she's been thinking about them. And so Mary, yeah, this first ignition point, give us a sense of how you were or what life was like before it, what the event was, and how you've been different afterwards.
Yeah, so the first one I was thinking about was as a child. And as a family, we'd moved from Sussex to Surrey, so from East Grinstead to Croydon. I was about 8, and I'd been there a few weeks and was happy there and was, enjoying my time and the learning and making new friends. And one lesson I was asked to leave by the head, the head of the school, who happened to be a
Right.
nun.
Okay.
And so she took me out into the hall. The school was based in a sort of manor house, and it's still there. And they've got lots of extensions now. And she said she basically accused me of stealing money.
Really?
Uh, and she said, since you've arrived, um, money has been going missing from children's coats or pockets or whatever. Uh, is it you? And I
Right.
said no. And she took my hands and smelt them to see
Right.
if they smelt of coins.
Right.
And I just felt such a deep sense of shame and
Right.
injustice because I knew I was innocent. I've never forgotten that.
No.
And I think the legacy it's left me with is always to presume innocence of
Sure.
anyone you've got to have a conversation with.
Yeah.
Assume they're coming from in the most general sense, the most honest place.
Yeah.
Not necessarily as extreme as that, but to assume people are telling the truth,
Yeah.
and also never to make anyone feel just crushed like that. So it had a big impact on me.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things in there. That idea of legacy is important for us to understand that probably all of our actions have a legacy, and certainly if they're relational, and sometimes I think as I've gone up kind of higher in the leadership level, I naturally have less contact with certain individuals just because I work across a lot of schools now. And that, for me, puts even more importance on every interaction I have with that individual because the legacy then stays until I have another interaction and able to either correct that or strengthen it. Yeah. And I guess, we can make links to working with students, can't we? There's that phrase that we sometimes use, that unconditional positive regard, isn't it? That you go into every situation thinking the best of someone. And then, of course, there are links to coaching and the idea that your first sort of instinct should be to understand before you start kind of acting. Wow, that is interesting. I was just trying to think if I had any related primary school. I got locked in a cupboard once by a teacher. I think that stayed with me, but more of a. I don't think it's had a huge impact, but that was. I think we talk about this, don't we, in terms of the science of learning, that things that affect you emotionally tend to stay with you because of, I guess, their magnitude. Or, yeah, hilarious. Okay. Well, again, this is the first one that we'll interact. So if you're new to the podcast, the next thing that we talk about is launch pads. And if you haven't seen the book, then we'll do some links to it at the end. And Mary's been kind enough to select two of the launch pads that have resonated with her. And so what I'll do is I'll talk through the slide as where it came from when I made it, and then we'll ask Mary to kind of build on that about why it resonates. And so this first one she chosen, called the 10th voice in the empty chair. And if you're reading this, then you will have read ahead, but I'll just read it out for listeners. Is that this idea of established groups of like-minded individuals can often create what we would call an echo chamber, where perceptions and beliefs just they naturally align. And sadly, that can create this thing called groupthink, where the group, thinks the same. And that often can limit any critical thinking because people aren't bringing different perspectives. But also, there's a danger that, the wider stakeholders are forgotten. And so this comes from two things, really. If we split it a little bit into this idea of the 10th voice to begin with. And the idea with this 10th voice is that where decisions have to be made, then one individual in that group is almost given the role or the job of providing an alternative viewpoint. And so another name for this might be devil's advocate. But it's really interesting in that they're given that job. Your job is to, whether you agree with it or not, whether you're completely on board with it, that's not your role in this situation. You have to think of a way or some evidence that you could put in counter to that. There's got to be a huge amount of psychological safety with this thing, because people need to be able to then privilege the team over their own thinking. So that's one element that we were sort of thinking about. And then the other one, which I tripped over when I was doing some reading about the 10th voice, was this idea of an empty chair. And I think, and these things are hard to track, aren't they? I think it comes from Jeff Bezos in Amazon originally, but I'm sure he got it from somebody else. And this is a fascinating one around physically adding an empty chair to meetings. And so that, this idea that it's unavoidable. The empty chair represents a type of stakeholder who can't be there. So in business, it might be a customer, but for us, it might be students or parents or something like that. And the idea then is that, as you go around and you discuss and you kind of get people's perspectives, you are visually drawn to this idea and a reminder that, hang on a minute, not everyone can be here. What would they say? How would this impact on them? And so really, that was where my thoughts went. And there was a couple of kind of warning things that came up that, we have to be mindful that any dissenting voices have to be managed carefully, and they can cause friction, which is just worth being up, in front of. That if it's always used, then potentially you normalize it. And there's a danger there that it's kind of like, oh, here we go again. Here's the 10th voice. And you go, we haven't listened to it for 15, times, so let's not bother this time. But also there's a danger that if you give somebody that role, everybody else thinks that they're not able to add criticality. It's almost like, oh, well, that's John's job. I've got to be positive. So there's some dangers in there. But Mary, why did it resonate with you?
Oh, it completely leapt out of me. I think there's so many great strategies and thought pieces in this book, but this one really, really resonated with me, sort of psychologically as well as intellectually. And in fact, I showed it straight away to my daughter Fran, who runs the business, and she's quite a tough egg,
Is she?
and she was equally impressed with this. And I can see why you've laid out some of the caveats for this, that it mustn't become something that becomes patterned, routine. I would say, poor routine, in that it's not fulfilling its symbolic role. But as a device, I just think it is so powerful. because in any kind of leadership role or any kind of position where you're going to have an impact, your decisions on other people, so that's really in almost any
Yeah.
circumstance, to consider, in particular, what it struck me for was the most vulnerable, least understood, least visible person or child in an organization.
Yeah.
And so that then that lens of what we're talking about is filtered through the impact on that individual who represents the underserved elements that
Yeah.
and in its widest sense, it's not just about material deprivation. It could be on a number of things, but it's it's a very clever, powerful way of stripping us away from our preconceptions,
Yeah.
and also, I mean, I haven't used it yet, but I'm going to,
Yeah.
but also beginning to tap into unconscious bias as well, which is
Yeah.
always a piece of work to be honest, never one and done. And I've been reflecting myself the last few days. Actually, I need to go back into some unconscious bias work myself, and
Yeah.
it seemed to me that it aligned with all that intention to be inclusive. So
Yeah.
I just thought it was marvelous. So thank you for offering it to the world.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, this is the slight guiltiness of the book is that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and just basically putting a spotlight on things that people might not be aware of, and then, as the name of the book suggests, giving them a launch pad to then go and learn
Mm.
some more. I think something you said then just resonated with me really strongly, and I need to think a bit more about this, about how you have to treat kind of the uncovering of cognitive biases as an ongoing pursuit, because I think when people start to get into this, and this would be my story, is that when I started learning about cognitive biases, I discovered the ones that I already had. And then there's a danger of going, oh, good, I've read that, I've sorted that.
Mm.
But I guess there needs to be constant monitoring, because I guess you might pick some up or some might become stronger. Is that
Oh yes. Also, it's like we don't decide to get fit and it's
right?
one exercise and done. I
Yeah.
just think it's part of human development, of part of being an intentional leader,
Yeah.
that we hold ourselves to account for that. So that was sort of an aid memoir,
Yeah.
this for me to continue that work. Mm.
I love that. Yeah. And again, we've talked about the dangers of systematizing things because they might lose value, but I'm definitely leaning more into this idea of creating almost like tripwires or systems that weed out some of the inconsistencies. I'm just thinking then, like, it wouldn't be too hard, would it, as a group of leaders to have a question that says, you know, are we subject to any biases here? Or, are we overlooking anything? Do we have any blind spots? Maybe some sort of questions that can be weaved into, I guess, existing structures that act as, yeah, maybe a
Mm.
tripwire. Interesting.
Mm.
Okay, brilliant. Well, let's keep pushing on. This next bit, we go back to kind of fast friends, and the question that Mary picked for her second question was: is there something that you've dreamed of doing for a long time, and why haven't you done it?
Um, I I think I'd have to say it would be going to the States. I've only ever stopped en route to go to Canada
Okay,
uh, for a piece of work a number of years or so ago now, and it was just a stopover. And I've never explored the States.
right.
And what I'd really like to do is go over on the boat and then fly back. I'd love to
Yeah,
do that slow. I think it takes about 5 days.
does it?
And actually, yes, and I did check it out. And then time ran away with me. So this is a
Yeah,
kind of refresher. Get it in the diary, Mary.
yeah.
Is that yeah, interesting. I thought it'd be more expensive than
Okay,
flying, but actually, the complete package, it might have changed since I last
sure.
looked, about 18 months or so ago. It was about the same. I
Was
just thought,
it?
oh, well,
Wow.
you're in a floating hotel for a week, so
Yeah,
surely it's more
lovely.
expensive. So I was pleasantly surprised. Not that it's a cheap option,
Of
but
course,
it was
no.
more reasonable than I expected.
Oh, I love that.
So why haven't I done it? I've um, yeah, I suppose time and not prioritizing it, and
Sure.
so it obviously hasn't been that important to me. But
Yeah.
I really would like to do it.
Would it would it be a kind of recreational thing, or would you be interested in looking at the American education system?
Yes, both. And so, I mean, I don't regard what I do as work in any case. It's just a
Sure.
really interesting way to spend your life. And so the two are very blended in any case. And so, yes, I would want to go and see, meet up with some colleagues firsthand.
Yeah.
Yeah, as well as explore the sites as well.
Oh, that would be great, wouldn't it? Have you got any, any sort of particular area that, any sites that you're, burning for you to see?
I don't, there's, I mean, I enjoy food. I wouldn't call myself a foodie, and I love other
Sure.
people cooking.
Yeah.
But there are some amazingly innovative restaurants over there, and so I'd be particularly keen to explore some of them. Some in Cincinnati and Chicago, as well as
Okay.
New York. Yeah, it's a bit quirky, but there we go.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah. Well, I did. I did an American summer camp actually when I was in my twenties, and I went the first time not thinking it would be, I didn't think it would change my life, and I ended up doing it 7 times after that,
Brilliant.
and almost kind of traveling in between, and did some really interesting trips. And I think I might be a frustrated cowboy because I was so taken by kind of Utah and Montana and all those kind of grand, vistas and all those things. So
Yeah,
I think I
yeah.
should probably get back there as well. Wicked. I'll join you on the boat, maybe. Brilliant. Well, the next thing we're going to talk about is your second ignition point, really. This other thing that happened to you that I guess has added some sort of transformation. Similar thing, really. Tell us a bit about, before, what happened, and then after.
Yeah, so that, when I was thinking about that, it was um, the impact that writing my first blog had. So before then, I had had a lot of ideas, and and I wanted to capture them, but there is that fear of putting your ideas out into the
Mm.
world, and also in those days, getting to grips with the tech. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
that difficult, but it was more doing things for the first time is always a bit tricky. So I, yeah, I had to do some thinking and steel myself to do it. I'm indebted to Dawn Cox, actually, the brilliant RE leader, who I worked with years ago in Suffolk. And I was talking with her about it, and she said, "Oh, just get over yourself, Mary. just, pre- just press play." And I ran some potential um, titles past her, and she said, "No, that wouldn't resonate very well." One of them being bored at the back.
Okay.
Because when I'm in schools, I'm looking at particularly in secondary, who are the ones who are switched off and
Yeah.
why. I'm just wondering why. And it's complex. It's never a blame game, but there are
Super.
things going on. Anyway, I didn't. It just ended up as Mary's blog. I think, and what I call it now is Curriculum 101, which I've now
Of
got off
course.
Substack. So I've written pretty much consistently, for over 10 years. But the reason, so before I wrote my first blog, um, yeah, I could see there was merit. I could see other people were writing, people like John Tomsit, Tom Sherrington, and lots of others. And I thought, well, yes, that's interesting. It's a great way to share. And
Mm.
so the ignition point then was realizing I need to do something. And then after, so the legacy of that, which is why I encourage everyone who wants to chat to me about raising their profile, becoming a consultant, or doing ad hoc freelance work. I encourage them all to put their ideas out into the universe.
Yeah.
No, it's not just for those people. I think it's really important that everyone has the chance to put their ideas out into the universe. But I
Yeah.
think particularly important if you are planning or actually doing independent work, because otherwise, how do people know about what you've got to offer? But for me, what happened after that was, and I would never have planned it myself, or was that um, Alex from John Catt publishers got in touch, say, would you like to write a blog, like to write a book? And so I was reflecting quite a lot at that time around what I saw in schools and the conversations I was having about the conditions for leaders to really crack on with the important stuff without ego, without, just really on a mission, but with lightness of touch and really enjoying
Yeah.
one another's company. And then also what it was like when children were offered difficult, demanding work and colleagues were supporting them to get there. So I was playing around with the ideas of high challenge and low threat. And at the same
Yeah.
time, I've been asked to do a TEDx talk.
Hmm.
And again, I don't think I'd have been invited if I hadn't been blogging.
Yeah.
And so it opened up so many opportunities for me, which I didn't realize at the time, that first toe in the water. And you do get some pushback sometimes. I mean, less so now, because I think the people who don't like my work probably don't open them, don't look out for it. But certainly at the beginning, there were people saying, can you justify this, Mary? Can you justify? Which I was happy to do. Or just saying, you're a soppy date or whatever.
Yeah.
Water up a
Yeah.
duck's back. You learn very quickly. Um, I always want robust debate and discussion of the ideas.
Yeah.
And so I'm very happy with that. And for the most part, that's what it's been. It's not been personal, but if it were personal, I just think, well, that's just you being immature, sweetheart.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, there's a couple of things there, and I mean, if would your advice to anyone who's kind of reticent about starting to blog be more than just kind of get over yourself? Is there any advice you would give them?
Sorry, that was a bit brutal, wasn't it? That's what I said to myself. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, something happens every week that we can reflect on,
Yeah.
and it will have happened in thousands, hundreds, and thousands of classrooms, but it will, or contexts or settings, but you will bring a unique perspective to it. And just to take little anecdotes or events or insights or children doing things unexpectedly well that you hadn't expected, to just write a paragraph or two about it.
Yeah.
And then other people will be able to reflect and it might help them. And
Yeah.
so it's about putting these gifts out into the world, and then you find actually interest comes back to you if what you're offering is worthwhile. What I've learned over the years is one idea basically per post. So the tendency is when we first get starting is to write reams and reams. We
Yeah.
want to get
Right.
all our stuff out there. No, so quite often when I'm talking with colleagues who do get going with their blogging. So
Yeah.
Substack, I've just sent out the monthly update, which I do once a month, last Thursday of the month. And in this one, I've pulled up, I think, about 4 or 5 different Substack educational posts that I think
Right.
when it's going out to 20,000 people, why wouldn't they want to know about these lovely things? And
Yeah.
so it's about being able to share their ideas. That very often when I'm feeding back to people, I say, there's so much information in there. Actually, when you go back and you're refreshing it, take one of those ideas and just expand on it. But
Yeah.
I've had to learn that over the years. Mm.
Well, that's great advice. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's also in my mind it can be a staged process, can't it? Like if you're not currently writing a private journal, maybe that's the place to start. Maybe just recording some thoughts privately, and then you slowly start making it public. I remember when I was going through that process, and somebody, a bit like the lady you spoke about, giving you some harsh feedback, said, "Chris, you know, there's not many people reading it anyway." you know, like you have this. Oh, I don't want to write it because yeah, there's about 2 people reading it. One of them is your mum. So just
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
put
So
it
we
in
mustn't get
perspective.
too precious about it. No.
Exactly, and I think that's really interesting as well. I mean, one of the launch pads that we're not talking about, but it resonates strongly with me, is this idea that leaders and potentially, hold things lightly. You're not putting it out there as the answer. You're just sharing some reflections, and you're open to and welcoming critique, really, if you can. I think that's a useful thing. And we talked a little bit in the previous Launchpad about this idea of psychological safety. And I think as leaders, if you can demonstrate that you are holding your ideas and your opinions lightly, you leave space for other people to try and join in, don't you?
Mm, mm.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay. Well, on that note, let's get into the second launchpad that you've selected. And so, in the same format, I'll just briefly explain this. And this one's, potentially more in people's kind of prior knowledge than the other ones. But it starts with this, this phrase is not mine, but, EQ is the new IQ. And this idea that emotional intelligence, I never really kind of forget this now because it's so important how many, my job is so relational that this is always on my mind, that emotional intelligence is the key to success in any endeavor that involves people, really. And so if you're a leader, it's pretty much everything you do. And if you're a leader of professional development for leaders, then this definitely should be on your mind. And if you haven't engaged with it, I mean, there's lots and lots of writers. To pick one, Daniel Goleman would be an obvious one. And in his sort of, I guess, way of describing this, he talks about, and there's a kind of an element of emotional intelligence that's to do with self, and then there's one to do with social, so kind of internal, external, if you want to do that. And then there's another kind of, I guess, element to it, or a strand, which talks about kind of recognition and then regulation. And so when you start mapping that out and you start putting it into kind of quadrants, you get this idea that people that are really kind of have high levels of emotional intelligence, they are very self-aware. So the combination of self and recognition equals self-awareness. When we think about that, if you were looking for tangible ways to kind of measure yours or to demonstrate, the ability for you to, on the tip of your tongue, talk about your strengths, your weaknesses, maybe what your emotional triggers are, and then linking back to what we spoke about earlier, your awareness of what, biases you might have, would be a demonstration. If you spread that across, there's something to know yourself, but then to be able to pick up on social kind of cues or kind of politics and stuff like that is really important. So as leaders, we have to reflect on how good we are at recognizing other people's emotions, their perspectives, and their needs. And if we're working in groups, which most of us are, and certainly if you're new to a group, the ability to pick up on those really subtle and sometimes hidden kind of group dynamics is important. To close off the matrix or the quadrant, I suppose, you then start talking about, it's one thing to know yourself, but can you manage yourself? And so it's one thing to know what your emotions are, but can you control them? Are you in control of stress levels, time management, those sorts of things? And how do you manage your motivation? And then, as you can imagine, the quadrant gets closed by this idea of how good at you are managing, social relationships or, external things, and how do you build trust and safety with people? How do you manage conflict? How do you manage performance? And so super interesting for leaders, not just to think about where are they at the moment, but where are their team, and how can they get better? So yeah, tell us a bit about why it resonates with you, Mary.
Um, I found Goldman's work really helpful when I first came across it a number of years ago. I think the big thread for me, though, in terms of emotional intelligence, is that as fully rounded human beings operating in a complex world,
Mm,
the tendency can be both in education and in wider organizations to privilege the intellectual and the cognitive over the emotional and the
yeah,
feelings. And there's increasing evidence that the those organizations that thrive in the largest sense of, if they're commercial, having reasonable profits, where they do well by the people who work for them, their employees, the local community, and all the stakeholders. It's all done with they tend to demonstrate, the leaders, and then it filters out collectively to the organization in this much more rounded way, which
Yeah.
includes paying attention to the emotional intelligence. And you can sense it when you go into organizations, whether they're schools or elsewhere. It's like, am I entering this space and being accommodated and greeted as though I'm a human being, or am I just a
Yeah.
number? And so it also happens. One of the reasons I'm doing business accelerator course based in the States, an
Right.
online course just coming to end now. And so these are some really hot, in relation to my own work and development of the business, just thinking about it from different lenses. So I'm working with some, or the people leading it, and it's not a huge group. They are incredibly successful, own all the things that have gone wrong,
Right.
um, but have this great human element around them. They talk very explicitly about um, conscious leadership. Actually, are we coming from a space which is seeing possibilities, seeing people for who they are, not shying away from difficult conversations, or are we coming from places of scarcity and want and blame? And
Okay.
so you can only really do that if you've got a degree of emotional intelligence and you're prepared to refresh it the whole time. And so, we start these meetings and there's at least 30 seconds, 45 seconds of holding a silence.
Right.
That is really hard to do.
It is.
I mean,
Oh,
I do a
interesting.
lot in my work. It is
Yeah.
hard when I want to create space for people to think. And so to have these hard-nosed business people,
Yeah.
and we are just going to sit and do box breathing for 4 rounds,
Right.
and then we'll start. So it centers people, and then it's coming to the work that's going to the stuff that's going to be discussed, with great intentional purpose. And
Yeah.
so again, you can only really do that if you've got this stuff around the EQ. And then
Yeah.
just as a random one, Rory Sutherland, who's this maverick who's big on TikTok, although
Okay.
he's 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 an advertising executive. He's a very, very larger than life character, and he's always saying that to for organizations to succeed, for marketing to succeed, you've got to tap into this human
Right.
maverick element. And so, for some reason or other, this sort of very staid middle-aged man has become a hit on TikTok, which is much surprise to him as to anyone else. But the important thing there is the thing that he's always saying, and similarly with the guys that I'm working with over in the States, is that there's far too much of a focus on the intellectual, on the logic,
Yeah.
on things being driven by metrics, and actually the real transformation is when you do it. You feed in as well the human side as well. So I just
Yeah.
find the whole thing fascinating, both intellectually and emotionally. So I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
No, I love it. Yeah, and it's not. I think it's so important. And I mean, I've been reflecting recently. I'm doing some work with the Church of England and on their leadership programs, and we're intentionally trying to put back some of the leader elements rather than leadership. That's self, and maybe some of the soft skills. And I was recounting something, the idea that if you spoke to 10 people and asked them to describe the 10 best leaders that they'd worked for, very rarely would they talk about anything intellectual. They wouldn't talk about the intellectual qualities of the leaders. It would be
Mm.
probably all, empathy, approachability, all the stuff that probably comes into this.
Mm.
And then the other thing that you said that I think is really interesting and something that I need to be better at both at home and at work, is my intentionality. Because I think, to use the kind of Steve Peters kind of chimp, kind of analogy, I'm still very driven by the chimp. Sometimes stuff gets out before there's been a chance for processing, and that idea of self-awareness being an understanding of your own biases or triggers is great. And I love the idea of the box breathing, because that's potentially one of those enforced pause moments that then allows intentionality. Is that right?
Yes, it also physically deregulates, de-stresses.
Right.
There's lots of evidence for it. It's also just a
Great.
nice thing to do.
It is, yeah. Well, I don't know how many viewers we've got, but I'm sure they'll all be going and doing box breathing after this, which is great. So we're going to finish off now, really, with Mary's last question. And I've got to admit, this is the one I'm looking forward to the most, only because I wouldn't imagine that Mary gets embarrassed very often. And so I was fascinated to hear about this. Tell us about a moment in your life that you were embarrassed then, Mary.
Well, it was trying to keep a straight face in front of year 11s when I was head of year 11.
Okay.
Um, I loved that role. I love pastoral roles.
Yeah.
And anyway, head, the deputy head's office had got some low chairs sitting, so there's low slung chairs for people waiting. And there were a handful of characters in year 11 who thought it would be amusing to take the screws out,
Oh no.
and which is quite could be dangerous depending on
Sure.
the age and fragility of the person sitting on them. But at the very minimum would have been quite uncomfortable and give you a shock.
Yeah.
So she was absolutely, quite rightly, hopping mad about this. So the whole of year 11 were shepherded into the hall for a
Right.
complete dressing down
Of course.
by the deputy head, who I had huge admiration and French. We used to share a car ride, the journey to school. So I knew her and her husband very well, and she was the typical character who had enormous presence, a heart of gold, but at a moment it could be
Right.
very, very strict. It was that wonderful combination,
Yeah.
which I always aspired to. And so now I'm back towards the back of this group, and she says in her booming voice, "I'm so disappointed with you. You're 11." And she said, "If you're that desperate for a screw, I suggest you go
Oh
to
my
the design and
goodness.
technology department." Well, I imploded,
Oh
and
my
it was
goodness.
deeply embarrassing because it looked as though I wasn't supporting her. But anyway, it was only the
Yeah.
students at the back who realised that there was something wrong with Mrs. Myatt as I scuttled off in
Yeah.
tears
Oh my
to
goodness.
the back. But they hadn't realised the filthy implications
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
go to the design and technology department. So it made me cringe afterwards that I couldn't contain myself. But
That's so funny.
but there we are.
That's so funny. And of course, those sorts of things become increasingly embarrassing because of the innocence of the other people. Because it really is a reflection on ourselves. Oh, what a great way to finish the podcast. Well, we'll literally just finish by saying thanks, really. And we've talked a little bit about how people can connect, but tell us a bit more about how they can kind of, connect with you online or get involved in any of the work you're doing.
Yes, so that's great. Thank you so much, Chris. So yes, so I've got the blog on Substack,
Oh,
Curriculum
yes.
101, which I write every Saturday on anything that I think is interesting to really sharpen my own thinking, and then on LinkedIn primarily, less so on X, and then marymart.com. You've got all the info there, and I love hearing from people. So
Great.
thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yeah, well, we'll put all the other links in the comments section. And again, if you want to connect with me on the socials, same thing. And if you're interested in the book, you can get it through the QR code. And so the only thing to say is again, thanks to Mary, and for everybody else, we'll see you at the next one.